Welcome to our deep dive into the world of psychology. We're going to be exploring a chapter from a college textbook, Psychology 2E, and it's really fascinating. We're going to be looking at the history of psychology, meeting some of the key figures, and even getting into a little bit of brain science.
I'm excited. This chapter is really interesting because it lays the foundation for everything that comes later. It's like the first episode of a TV series that sets the stage.
Okay, so first things first. What struck me is how incredibly vast psychology actually is.
Right. It's so much more than just couches and therapy, although those are important parts of it.
I know. This chapter is like a panoramic view. It shows us all the different areas that psychology covers. So let's start with the history. The book starts with Wilhelm Wundt, who created the very first experimental psychology lab back in 1879 in Germany.
Can you imagine? A lab filled with all sorts of gadgets and contraptions trying to measure reaction times and sensory experiences.
Wow. To do that, he used introspection, where people would describe their own thoughts and feelings. It seems tricky to get reliable data from that, though, right?
Yeah, that's the problem. Introspection is very subjective. Two people could describe the same experience in completely different ways. It's like trying to describe what happiness feels like. Everyone's experience is going to be unique, so it's hard to draw general conclusions from that kind of data.
Right. So how did psychology move on from that?
Well, we have William James to thank for that. He was an American psychologist, and instead of focusing on the structure of the mind like Wundt, he was more interested in its function.
So, like, what purpose do our thoughts and feelings serve?
Exactly. He called his approach functionalism.
That makes a lot more sense to me. Why do we behave the way we do? What's the point of all this thinking and feeling?
And he was very influenced by Darwin's theory of evolution. James believed that our mental processes, like any other trait, had to have evolved for a reason, to help us adapt and survive.
It's fascinating to think that our minds are shaped by the need to adapt and thrive. Did James continue to use introspection?
No, he didn't rely solely on people's subjective reports. He used more objective measures, like recording devices and physiological data.
So, a move towards more scientific methods.
Absolutely. He really paved the way for how psychology is studied today.
And of course, we can't talk about early psychology without mentioning Sigmund Freud.
Oh, Freud. He's a household name, even for people who don't know much about psychology.
I know. And his ideas are still debated today. But his work was groundbreaking in that he focused on the power of the unconscious mind, those thoughts, feelings, and desires that we're not even aware of.
It's like an iceberg. What we see on the surface is just a tiny part of what's going on beneath.
Exactly. And he believed that our unconscious mind, shaped by our early childhood experiences, can drive our actions in ways that we don't even realize.
To explore this hidden world, he developed psychoanalysis, which is often called the talking cure. He used techniques like dream analysis and free association, where patients just talk freely to allow those unconscious thoughts and feelings to surface.
That sounds intense.
Yeah.
So from the depths of the unconscious mind, how did psychology shift to something a bit more upbeat?
Well, that's where Abraham Maslow comes in. He focused on human potential and growth, and he believed that everyone has an inherent drive towards self-actualization, becoming the best version of themselves.
I like that. It's a much more optimistic view of human nature. How did he explain this drive towards self-actualization?
He proposed the famous hierarchy of needs, which is often represented as a pyramid. At the bottom are our basic needs for survival, like food and shelter.
Right, like you can't focus on your dreams if you're starving.
Exactly. As those basic needs are met, we can move up the pyramid to higher level needs like love, belonging, and ultimately self-actualization.
It's like climbing a ladder, one step at a time, but each step builds upon the one below it.
Precisely. And Maslow also emphasized qualitative research using methods like in-depth interviews and case studies. He argued that to truly understand the human experience, we need to go beyond just numbers and statistics and really understand the individual's perspective.
So it's like appreciating the whole picture, not just looking at a few data points. Now, all of these early schools of thought laid the groundwork, but the field didn't stop there. The book talks about the cognitive revolution, which brought a renewed focus on mental processes.
Think of it like upgrading from a basic calculator to a powerful computer. Psychologists started to explore things like how we think, learn, remember, and solve problems.
So instead of just observing behavior, they started trying to understand what's happening inside the black box of the mind.
Absolutely. And this shift really laid the groundwork for the development of cognitive psychology, which has had a huge impact on fields like education and artificial intelligence.
It's amazing how far psychology has come. And the field is still growing and changing all the time.
Right. We have developmental psychology, which studies how we change across the lifespan, and personality psychology, which looks at what makes each of us unique, just to name a few.
Wow. And with so many areas of study, there's so many career options in psychology, too.
Absolutely. There are clinical psychologists, research psychologists, and everything in between.
It's truly a fascinating field. But the book doesn't stop at different schools of thought. It also delves into the biological underpinnings of psychology, exploring the brain and nervous system.
After all, our thoughts, feelings, and actions all stem from the brain.
And one of the first big questions is the nature-nurture debate, which is about how much of who we are is determined by our genes versus our environment.
It's like asking, are we born this way, or do our experiences make us who we are?
It's a classic question, and I'm guessing it's more complicated than just picking one side.
It is. Modern psychology tells us that both nature and nurture are important, and that they interact in complex ways. We might inherit certain predispositions from our genes, but how those predispositions are expressed depends on our experiences.
So it's this dynamic interplay, and that makes so much more sense to me. Now, this deep dive into biology goes even further. The book talks about the nervous system, that intricate network that carries information throughout our bodies.
It's like the internet of our body, connecting everything together. And at the heart of the system are neurons, those specialized cells that transmit information through electrical and chemical signals.
I remember those from biology class. It's amazing to think that billions of these tiny cells are working together to coordinate everything we do.
And the book explains how neurons work, how they receive, transmit, and integrate information. Understanding this intricate network of communication is essential for understanding how our brains function, from simple reflexes to complex thought processes.
So these microscopic cells are the building blocks of our thoughts and actions. That's just mind-blowing. And then there are hormones, those powerful chemical messengers that travel through our bloodstream.
Those are produced by the endocrine system, another complex network that works in tandem with the nervous system.
I love that. The endocrine system and nervous system working together like partners in a dance. The book mentions how hormones affect everything from our mood to our sleep to even how we make decisions.
It's really quite incredible how these tiny molecules can have such a profound impact on who we are and how we behave. And this is just one example of how intertwined our biological and psychological experiences truly are.
So we've journeyed through the history of psychology, we've explored different schools of thought, and we've even delved into the biological underpinnings of the mind. What I'm seeing is how psychology uses scientific methods to understand these complex aspects of being human.
You've hit the nail on the head. Psychology is a science, and it relies on rigorous research to understand the mind and behavior.
And speaking of research, the book gives us a good overview of the methods that psychologists use.
Yes, it all starts with the scientific method, that systematic approach to acquiring knowledge that involves formulating hypotheses, designing experiments, collecting data, and drawing conclusions.
It's a framework for scientific discovery that ensures our knowledge is based on evidence.
Precisely. And the book talks about different types of research designs, like experimental studies where researchers manipulate variables to understand cause and effect relationships.
Right, like giving one group of people a new drug and another group a placebo pill to see if the drug actually works.
Exactly. But there are also correlational studies which look for relationships between variables without manipulating them directly.
So like how ice cream sales might go up when it's hot outside, but that doesn't mean eating ice cream causes hot weather.
That's a great example. And no matter the method, psychologists are committed to ethical research practices.
Well, that's reassuring. From those early labs with all their gadgets to the sophisticated methods used today, psychology has come a long way. But even with all these advances, I feel like we've only just begun to scratch the surface.
I agree. As we continue our deep dive, we'll explore even more fascinating aspects of psychology, uncovering new insights into how we perceive the world, how we learn from our experiences, and how we navigate the complexities of being human. And as we continue our exploration, we're moving into the realm of sensation and perception, which is all about how we experience the world through our senses.
It's like trying to understand how our brains take in all that information from the outside world, the sights and sounds and smells and tastes and everything, and turn it into something meaningful.
Exactly. It starts with sensation, that process of detecting physical stimuli from the environment. Our sensory organs, those amazing things like our eyes and ears, they act as receptors, taking those stimuli and turning them into signals that the brain can understand.
Oh, I see. So it's like our senses are the input channels, feeding raw data to our brains.
That's a great way to put it. But that's just the first step. Then perception comes into play. It's how our brains organize, interpret, and ultimately make sense of all that sensory data, like the software that transforms those raw signals into a movie we can watch.
So our brains are constantly constructing our reality based on what our senses are telling us.
Exactly. And that's one of the most important takeaways here. Perception isn't just passive. It's actively shaped by our experiences, expectations, even our cultural background.
So what we perceive isn't just a mirror image of reality, but a unique interpretation.
Precisely. And that's what makes those visual illusions so fascinating, those mind-bending tricks that show the difference between what we see and what's actually there.
I love those. They show us how our brains are always trying to make sense of things, even when the information is incomplete or ambiguous.
Exactly. And to really understand those illusions, we need to dive deeper into how our senses actually work. Let's start with vision, that amazing sense that allows us to see light, color, and form.
I remember learning the basics, like how light enters the eye and hits the retina at the back. But how does that get turned into an image?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The retina is packed with special cells called photoreceptors, rods and cones that convert light into those neural signals we talked about earlier.
Rods and cones. Remind me which does what again?
The rods allow us to see in low light, while the cones are responsible for color vision and seeing those fine details.
Oh, right. So it's like the rods are our night vision goggles and the cones are the high-definition cameras.
That's a great analogy. But those signals don't just stop at the retina. They travel along the optic nerve all the way to the brain, where different areas process that information, allowing us to perceive depth, motion, and form.
Wow, it's like a relay race.
And that processing is heavily influenced by our expectations and experiences. Our brains are always making predictions based on what we've seen before.
Oh, that makes sense. Like when we recognize a friend's face, even if it's partially hidden.
Exactly. Our brains fill in the gaps. And just like with vision, our other senses involve complex processing and interpretation. Let's take hearing, for example, how those sound waves are perceived as music, language, or that cacophony of the city.
Hearing is so powerful. It can evoke memories, change our mood, and it's how we communicate with each other.
You're absolutely right. Those sound waves travel through the air and vibrate our eardrum. That vibration sets off a chain reaction in the middle ear, involving those tiny bones, the hammer, anvil, and stirrup that amplify those vibrations.
I remember those. It's like this tiny, delicate mechanism.
And those amplified vibrations reach the cochlea in the inner ear, which is this spiral-shaped, fluid-filled structure. It's lined with tiny hair cells, and those are incredibly sensitive, bending in response to the sound waves.
So depending on how fast those sound waves vibrate, different hair cells are activated, and that's how we hear different pitches.
Exactly. And our auditory system is pretty amazing. It not only allows us to perceive pitch, but also loudness, the quality of a sound, and even where that sound is coming from.
So we can tell if someone is calling our name from behind us.
That's right. And just like our other senses, hearing is shaped by experience. We learn to filter out background noise, and we can even anticipate what we're going to hear based on the situation.
That's why we can follow a conversation in a crowded room.
Exactly. But we have so many other senses working together to create our experience. Taste, smell, touch, balance, even proprioception, which is our sense of body position.
Proprioception, that's how we can close our eyes and still touch our nose, right?
That's it. And each sense has its own specialized receptors and pathways in the brain.
Wow. So it's not just one sense at a time, it's all these different senses working together.
They're all contributing to our understanding of the world around us. Now, moving on from sensation and perception, let's talk about learning. This is how we gain new knowledge, skills, and behaviors through experience.
Learning that's essential for survival. It helps us adapt to a constantly changing world.
You're absolutely right. And there are different types of learning. Remember classical conditioning, Pavlov and his dogs.
Oh yeah. Ring a bell, the dog salivates. It's about associating two stimuli, even if they seem unrelated.
Exactly. In Pavlov's experiment, that neutral stimulus, the bell, came to trigger the response, salivation, because it was repeatedly paired with the food. The dogs learned to associate the two.
And we see that with humans too, like how a particular smell might bring back a vivid memory.
Precisely. Those are learned responses shaped by past experiences. But classical conditioning is just one type of learning. We also have operant conditioning, where we learn through the consequences of our actions.
Rewards and punishments.
Exactly. It's the idea that behaviors followed by rewards are more likely to be repeated, and behaviors followed by punishments are less likely to occur again.
It's like positive reinforcement. If we get praised for something, we're more likely to do it again.
And on the flip side, if we get scolded for something, we're less likely to do it again. Think about how we use these principles in everyday life.
Giving a dog a treat for sitting, getting a bonus at work for good performance.
Exactly. But we also learn by watching others. This is called observational learning.
Like watching a YouTube tutorial to learn a new skill.
You got it. We learn by observing others' actions and their consequences without having to go through it ourselves.
It's like learning by example. Are there other types of learning?
There's cognitive learning, which emphasizes the role of mental processes in learning, things like problem solving and forming mental representations.
Well, that's interesting. So it's not just about mimicking or responding to rewards and punishments. It's about actively thinking and analyzing information.
You're right. It's about actively engaging with the learning process, making connections, and building understanding.
Learning is so much more complex than I realized.
It is. And all those forms of learning work together to shape who we are. Now, as we delve deeper into learning, we enter the world of cognition, how we think, reason, and make decisions.
Cognition is like trying to understand the operating system of the brain.
A great analogy. And one of the key concepts in cognition is the idea of concepts and prototypes, the mental categories we use to organize all the information we encounter.
Concepts like dog, tree, chair, things that share common features.
Precisely. Concepts help us make sense of the world by grouping similar things together. And prototypes are the best examples of a concept. Like a golden retriever might be our prototype for dog.
So when we think of dog, a golden retriever pops into our mind.
Exactly. But our brains also use schemas, which are these mental frameworks based on our experiences.
Like a mental script for what to expect in a particular situation.
Right. Think about going to a restaurant. You'll probably have to wait to be seated, look at a menu, order food, and so on.
It's like having a mental checklist.
It helps us navigate through those familiar situations, but it can also lead to biases if we rely on them too rigidly.
Oh, that's interesting. We have to be careful not to let our schemas blind us to new information or different ways of doing things.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about language, that system of symbols and rules that lets us communicate complex ideas.
Language is so powerful. It connects us to each other and allows us to share our thoughts and feelings.
And the textbook talks about the structure of language, those building blocks like phonemes, which are the basic sounds of speech, and morphemes, the smallest units of meaning.
It's like breaking down a sentence to understand how it works.
Exactly. And language doesn't just help us communicate, it can actually shape the way we think.
Oh, that's fascinating. So the language we speak can actually influence our thoughts.
The research suggests that it can. It can affect how we perceive things, how we remember information, even how we make decisions.
Language is so much more than just words. It's a powerful tool that shapes our understanding of the world.
It is. Now let's move on to problem solving, those mental gymnastics we do to overcome obstacles and achieve goals.
Problem solving is essential in life. We do it every day, from figuring out how to set something that's broken to navigating those tricky social situations.
And the textbook talks about different approaches to problem solving, like algorithms, which are those step-by-step procedures that guarantee a solution, and heuristics, which are those mental shortcuts.
So algorithms are like following a recipe, and heuristics are more like rules of thumb.
Exactly. Algorithms are more reliable, but they can be time-consuming. Heuristics are faster, but they don't always work.
So it's like choosing between taking the scenic route, which is slower but more reliable, or taking a shortcut, which might be faster but might also lead you astray.
And there are obstacles to problem solving, too. One is functional fixedness, where we get stuck in our usual ways of thinking and can't see things from a different perspective.
Like that classic whittle where you have to figure out how to attach a candle to a wall using only a box of matches, a candle, and a tack. You have to use the matchbox as a holder for the candle.
That's it. Sometimes we need to break free from those mental constraints and think outside the box. Now, speaking of cognitive challenges, let's dive into intelligence, a topic that has fascinated and puzzled people for centuries.
What is intelligence, really? Is it one general ability, or is it a collection of specific skills?
That's the big question. There are different theories. Charles Spearman proposed the idea of general intelligence, a single underlying factor that influences our performance on a variety of cognitive tasks.
So if you're high in this G factor, you're likely to do well on a lot of different mental challenges.
That's the idea, but Howard Gardner proposed a theory of multiple intelligences, suggesting that we have distinct abilities that are independent of each other.
So instead of one type of intelligence, there are many, like musical intelligence or interpersonal intelligence.
Exactly. He argued that we should recognize and nurture these different talents rather than just focusing on the traditional academic kind of intelligence.
It's a much more inclusive view of intelligence. But how do we measure something as complex as intelligence?
That's where intelligence tests come in, but they've been controversial because of concerns about cultural bias and whether they truly capture all aspects of intelligence.
I can see why that's a problem. Tests designed for one cultural group might not be fair or accurate for people from other backgrounds.
That's right. It's important to use them cautiously and to remember that they only provide a limited snapshot of a person's abilities.
So what about the nature-nurture debate when it comes to intelligence?
Well, the evidence suggests that both genetics and environment play a role. We might inherit certain predispositions for intelligence, but our environment, like our upbringing, our education, our social interactions, has a huge impact on how those genes are expressed.
So our genes might provide the potential, but our environment determines how that potential is realized.
Exactly. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of the human experience: lifespan development. This is the journey of growth and change that we go through from conception all the way to old age.
It's like the story of our lives, from beginning to end.
Lifespan development is a dynamic interplay between biological maturation, how our bodies and brains develop, and the experiences we have along the way.
So it's not just about physical growth.
No, it's about developing cognitively, socially, and emotionally. It's about navigating those transitions and milestones that mark each stage of life.
And those early experiences can have such a profound impact on who we become.
Absolutely. The textbook starts with prenatal development, that incredible transformation from a single fertilized egg into a fully formed infant. It's a time of rapid cell division and specialization, forming all the organs and systems of the body.
Prenatal care is so important during that time to ensure the baby's health and well-being.
It is. Then, after birth, we enter infancy and childhood, those formative years filled with learning and exploration.
Kids are like little sponges absorbing so much information.
And there are different theories about how cognitive development unfolds during this time. Each's stages of cognitive development is one classic framework.
Oh yeah, I remember that. He talks about different stages, like the sensorimotor stage, where babies learn through their senses and actions, and then later stages where they develop more abstract thinking.
You got it. And alongside Piaget, we have Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, which focuses on the social and emotional challenges we face throughout life.
Erikson talks about things like developing trust in infancy, forming an identity in adolescence, and finding intimacy in adulthood.
Those are crucial milestones in our social and emotional development.
And then adolescence hits, that time of huge transitions.
Right. Adolescence is all about identity formation. Those teenage years filled with hormonal changes, peer pressure, and the quest for independence. It's a time of questioning everything and trying to figure out who you are.
It's a roller coaster of emotions.
And the brain is still developing during this time, especially the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for things like planning and decision-making.
That explains why teenagers can sometimes be impulsive.
Then adolescence gives way to adulthood, with its own set of challenges and rewards.
Adulthood is such a long and varied stage of life.
It is. It encompasses career choices, romantic relationships, starting families, and figuring out your place in the world. And even within adulthood, there are different phases, each with its own unique characteristics.
And development doesn't just stop once you reach adulthood. We keep learning and growing throughout our lives.
Exactly. And eventually, we reach the later stages of life where we face the realities of aging and the inevitability of death.
Those are topics that are often difficult to talk about.
They are, but they're important to consider. How do we cope with loss, find meaning and purpose as we age, and ultimately come to terms with our own mortality?
These are deep questions.
They are. And the textbook touches on these issues with sensitivity, acknowledging the challenges of aging and the grief and loss that accompany death.
It's a reminder that aging and death are natural parts of life.
Exactly. And it's an invitation to approach these transitions with compassion and understanding. So, as we conclude our exploration of lifespan development, we see that it's an amazing journey of growth and change.
It's incredible how much we change and adapt throughout our lives.
It is. We go through these different stages, each with its own unique challenges and triumphs. And the textbook emphasizes that each person's life story is unique, even though there are certain commonalities.
So from those first moments of life to the twilight years, we're constantly evolving.
Exactly. It's a testament to the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Now, let's shift gears and dive into the world of motivation and emotion, those driving forces that fuel our actions and color our perceptions.
Motivation and emotion, they're what make us feel alive.
They give us energy, purpose, and meaning. They're behind our desires, our decisions, and our experiences. And the textbook explores different theories of motivation, offering different lenses through which to view those forces that shape our behavior. We have instinct theory, drive reduction theory, arousal theory. They each highlight different aspects.
So are we driven by instincts, by needs, by a desire for stimulation, or by a combination of all of these?
That's the question. And each theory offers a piece of the puzzle. Instinct theory suggests that certain behaviors are hardwired, like a baby's instinct to suckle for nourishment. Those are automatic, essential for survival.
So some behaviors are basically pre-programmed.
Exactly. But drive reduction theory focuses on our internal states. We eat when we're hungry, drink when we're thirsty. These are driven by a need to maintain homeostasis, that state of balance and stability.
Our bodies are always working to maintain a steady state, like a thermostat.
And then there's arousal theory, which suggests that we seek out a certain level of stimulation, whether that's through exciting activities or quiet relaxation.
So some people love roller coasters, and some people prefer curling up with a good book. We're all trying to hit that sweet spot of stimulation, right?
You got it. So we see that motivation is this complex interplay of internal drives and external factors.
Okay, let's talk about some specific motives. What about hunger and eating? That's a pretty basic drive.
You're right. But even something as basic as hunger involves complex interactions between our brains and our bodies. The textbook talks about the hypothalamus, a region of the brain that acts like a control center for hunger and satiety. It receives signals from our digestive system, our hormones, and even our thoughts and emotions, all to regulate our eating behavior.
It's like our brains are constantly monitoring our energy levels and telling us when to eat and when to stop.
Right. And then we have hormones like leptin and ghrelin. Leptin is produced by fat cells and signals that we're full, while ghrelin is produced in the stomach and signals hunger.
It's this constant conversation between hunger and fullness signals.
Exactly. But our eating habits are influenced by more than just biology. Our environment and experiences play a big role too. Think about cultural norms and family traditions around food.
Oh, that's true. Different cultures have such different approaches to food.
Exactly. And those cultural influences shape our preferences and habits.
So food is both biological and cultural. Now, what about another powerful drive, sexual behavior?
This is another area where biology and culture intertwine. The textbook acknowledges the diversity of human sexual expression and highlights how both biological and social factors contribute to our understanding of sexuality.
It's not just about biology, it's also about how society shapes our attitudes and beliefs about sex.
Right. And to understand the complexity, we need to start with the biology. Hormones, especially testosterone and estrogen, have a huge impact on sexual desire and arousal.
So hormones are the foundation.
They are. And then there's the sexual response cycle, which describes the physiological changes that occur during sexual activity. There's excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. These stages involve complex interactions between the nervous system and the endocrine system.
It's a fascinating process.
It is. But remember, our sexual attitudes and behaviors are also shaped by our cultural background, our personal experiences, and our relationships.
Right, our sexuality is influenced by so many different factors.
Exactly. We learn about sex from our families, our peers, the media, and our own experiences. And all of these things contribute to our understanding of what's considered normal and acceptable.
So from biology to culture, sexual behavior is a rich tapestry of influences.
It is. And finally, let's explore the fascinating world of emotions, those subjective experiences that color our perceptions, drive our actions, and give depth to our lives.
Emotions make us human.
You're right. They enrich our experiences and connect us to each other. And there are many theories about how emotions arise. One is the James Lange theory, which suggests that our emotions are a consequence of our physiological responses.
So we feel scared because our heart is racing, not the other way around.
Exactly. But the Cannon-Bard theory argues that our physiological responses and emotional experiences happen simultaneously.
So we feel the fear and our body reacts at the same time.
Precisely. And the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory adds another layer. It suggests that our cognitive interpretations of those physiological responses play a key role in the emotion we experience.
So if my heart is racing, I might feel scared if I think I'm in danger, but excited if I'm about to go on a roller coaster.
You got it. The context and our interpretation influence how we label those feelings.
So even though we all experience the same basic emotions, how we express and interpret those emotions can be influenced by our culture, our beliefs, and our personal experiences. So like we're all speaking the same language of emotions, but with different accents.
And that's what makes studying emotions so fascinating. Now, to understand how emotions play out in our interactions with others, we turn to social psychology.
So social psychology is about zooming out and looking at the bigger picture of how we behave in groups, how we influence each other, and how those social interactions shape our thoughts and feelings.
You got it. And one of the key insights from social psychology is the power of the situation. This means that our behavior is often influenced by the social context, even if we're not aware of it.
So it's not just about our personality, it's also about the situation we're in.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
A classic example is the Stanford Prison Experiment. Those college students who were randomly assigned to be prisoners or guards, their behavior was dramatically influenced by those roles, even though it was just an experiment.
Wow. It shows how easily we can be influenced by social roles and expectations.
It does. And social psychology also explores conformity, which is our tendency to adjust our behavior to fit in with a group. Remember that classic experiment where people were shown lines of different lengths?
The ones where people gave the wrong answer just because everyone else did.
That's the one. It shows how powerful social pressure can be.
So we conform either because we think the group is right or because we just don't want to stand out.
Exactly. It's a balance between wanting to be right and wanting to be liked. And this plays out in all sorts of ways in our lives, from the clothes we wear to the opinions we express.
Speaking of opinions, where do our attitudes fit into all this? Our likes and dislikes.
Attitudes are our evaluations of people, objects, and ideas. They guide our decisions and actions, but they don't always predict our behavior perfectly. Sometimes we act in ways that contradict our attitudes.
Like when we say we care about the environment but still drive a gas-guzzling car.
That's a great example. And when that happens, we experience cognitive dissonance, that feeling of discomfort that arises when our actions don't match our beliefs.
So we either change our behavior or we find ways to justify it. Our brains want to keep things consistent.
Exactly. And now let's address a darker aspect of social interaction, prejudice and discrimination. These are those negative attitudes and behaviors directed towards people based on their group membership.
Sadly, prejudice and discrimination are all too common.
They are, and they lead to inequality and injustice. Social psychology helps us understand the roots of these problems. For example, we tend to categorize people into groups, an us versus them mentality.
And we tend to favor our own group, even if those groups are based on something completely arbitrary.
That's right. And those in-group, out-group dynamics can lead to prejudice, where we see our group as superior. And that can be fueled by stereotypes, those overgeneralized beliefs about entire groups of people.
And stereotypes can lead to discrimination, which is unfair treatment based on group membership.
You've got it. And sometimes we might not even be aware of our biases. We might hold implicit biases, those unconscious attitudes that can affect our behavior without our realizing it.
So prejudice is a complex issue with roots in how our brains work.
It is. And that means combating prejudice requires conscious effort, self-reflection, and education.
We need to be aware of our biases and work to challenge them.
Absolutely. Now let's move on to a more positive topic, interpersonal attraction. What draws us to certain people? What makes us want to be friends or romantic partners?
It's like trying to understand this secret formula for human connection.
Well, research suggests that it's a combination of factors. Physical attractiveness plays a role, but it's not the only thing. Similarity matters too. We're drawn to people who share our values, interests, and beliefs.
Birds of a feather flock together.
That's right. And proximity matters too. We're more likely to form relationships with people we see often.
Familiarity can breed liking. And what about once a relationship is formed? What makes it last?
Reciprocity is important. That mutual exchange of positive feelings and actions. Both partners need to feel valued and appreciated.
It's like a give and take.
Exactly. And as relationships deepen, we might experience different types of love, from that passionate, intense love early on to the more companionate love that develops over time.
So love is a journey. It changes and evolves as relationships grow.
Exactly. And as we conclude this dive into social psychology, it's clear that our interactions with others are incredibly important in shaping who we are.
From those subtle influences like conformity to the profound bonds of love, our social connections are truly woven into our lives.
And this exploration has only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to discover about the forces that shape our social world.
It's a reminder that we're not just individuals. We're part of this complex web of social relationships that influence us in countless ways.
And those relationships, those interactions with others, they're a fundamental part of what it means to be human. It is. It's like we're all speaking the same language of emotions, but with different accents and dialects. It's what makes studying emotions so fascinating, how biology, cognition, and culture all mix together to shape those powerful subjective experiences.
So true. Now, to see how these emotions affect how we interact with each other, we'll move on to social psychology.
Social psychology is like zooming out and looking at the bigger picture, how we act in groups, how we influence each other, and how those social interactions shape our thoughts, feelings, and actions.
It's like the dance of human interaction with all those subtle cues and unspoken rules.
Exactly. And one of the key insights from social psychology is this idea of the power of the situation. The idea that our behavior is often shaped by the social context, even when we don't realize it.
So it's not just about individual personalities, it's also about the environment and the people around us.
You got it. The Stanford prison experiment showed this dramatically. Remember those college students assigned to be prisoners or guards?
Oh yeah, the experiment was pretty intense.
It showed how easily people can conform to social roles, even when those roles clash with their personal values.
It's a little scary to think about, but it also shows how powerful those social influences can be.
It does. Social psychology also explores conformity, our tendency to change our behavior or beliefs to match those of a group. Think of that classic experiment where people were shown lines of different lengths.
Oh yeah, the ones where people gave the wrong answer on purpose and then the participants went along with it even though they knew it was wrong.
Precisely. It shows how strong social pressure can be.
So we conform because we want to be right, or we just don't want to be the odd one out.
Exactly. It's that balance between fitting in and trusting our own judgment. And this happens all the time in our lives.
All the time. Okay, so where do our attitudes fit into all of this? You know, those things we like and dislike.
Attitudes are like mental shortcuts. There are evaluations of people, objects, and ideas. They guide our decisions and actions, but our actions don't always match our attitudes perfectly.
That makes sense. We might say we believe in one thing, but then do something totally different.
Right, like when we say we support environmental protection but still drive a gas-guzzling car. When that happens, we experience cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling we get when our actions contradict our beliefs.
So we either change our behavior or we try to justify it so we don't feel so bad. Our minds like things to be consistent.
Exactly. Now let's turn to a darker topic: prejudice and discrimination. These are negative attitudes and behaviors directed at people based on their group membership.
Prejudice and discrimination are still such big problems.
They are, and they create so much injustice in the world. Social psychology helps us understand where these problems come from. We have this tendency to put people into categories, to see the world as us versus them.
Right, and then we favor our own group, even if those groups are based on something random.
That in-group bias can lead to prejudice, where we think our group is better. And this is often fueled by stereotypes, those overgeneralized beliefs about entire groups.
And stereotypes can then lead to discrimination, which is unfair treatment based on someone's group membership.
You got it. And what's even more challenging is that we can hold implicit biases, those unconscious attitudes that influence our behavior without our even realizing it.
So prejudice isn't just about being a bad person, it's also about how our brains are wired.
Exactly. And that means that tackling prejudice requires a lot of conscious effort, self-awareness, and education.
It's a challenge, but a necessary one. Okay, let's end on a more positive note. What about interpersonal attraction? Why are we drawn to certain people?
Interpersonal attraction, that's a question that has fascinated people forever. Research shows it's a mix of things. Of course, physical attractiveness is part of it, but it's not everything. Similarity also plays a role. We tend to be attracted to people who share our values, interests, and beliefs.
Birds of a feather flock together.
You got it. And proximity matters too. We're more likely to form relationships with people we see and interact with frequently.
That makes sense. Familiarity can lead to attraction. So what about when a relationship is formed? What helps it last?
Reciprocity is key, that mutual exchange of positive feelings and actions. It's about both partners contributing and making each other feel valued and appreciated.
Like a two-way street.
Exactly. And as relationships develop, we can experience different kinds of love, from passionate love, which is that intense, all-consuming feeling at the beginning, to companionate love, which is that deep, affectionate bond that grows over time.
So love changes and evolves as relationships mature.
That's right. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into social psychology. It's clear that our interactions with others are incredibly powerful.
I agree. From subtle influences like conformity to the deep bonds of love, our social connections are such a big part of who we are and how we experience the world.
Absolutely, and we've just scratched the surface of this fascinating field. There's so much more to explore.
It's amazing to think about all these different factors that shape our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. It's like a giant puzzle, and psychology is trying to put all the pieces together.
You've got it. And the more we learn about psychology, the more we understand ourselves and the world around us.
And that's what makes this deep dive so rewarding. It's a journey of self-discovery and a chance to appreciate the incredible complexity of the human experience. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into psychology.
It's been a pleasure.